Welcome to this lunch lecture with the CKG, Chalmers Group or Chalmers Christian Group. Today we have the honor to welcome Mikael Genholm, who is a theologian and chairman of the Swedish Apologetics Society. I will remind you to please now open your cans together. Music. That's a good sound. Yeah, I'll let you do your thing.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Very nice to be here. Normally, I live in Uppsala, and I had this talk on the Swedish Royal School of Technology, Tekniska högskolan in Stockholm. It was quite significant because it was the first place where nobody laughed at my jokes. But I hope that Gothenburg is better. I've heard so due to the puns and all that. But I think the reason that nobody laughed at me was because a lot of people felt skeptical to the topic at hand, which is understandable, because Sweden is a secular society, and especially in this type of academic environment, it's natural for people to be skeptic, which I like. Now, what I tried to do is to show that miracles are actually something that exists, and with miracles I mean supernatural phenomena. And it's okay if you disagree, but I'd like to challenge those of you who think that miracles is not something that a reasonable, intelligent person can believe in. I want to show you that at least it's a rational option for an intellectual thinker. I'm not the first one trying to show or find if miracles or answers to prayer can be empirically verified. So, for example, a quite infamous study is called the Great Prayer Experiment. It was committed in 2006 by a physician called Benson and his team, and they wanted to show or find if people actually got better due to prayer when they were supposed to get heart surgery. So they looked at 1,800 heart patients that went through bypass surgery, and one group of people they organized prayer for, another group they didn't organize prayer for, and what they found was quite interesting because they found that those who received prayer had a worse time than those who didn't. And this was highlighted by Richard Dawkins, the atheist pope, as I like to call him, who in his The God Delusion writes about how this basically shows that prayer doesn't work and that it disproves miracles once and for all. Now, I don't agree with Dawkins on this and many other points. There was several problems with this prayer study. One of them was a very confused definition of prayer. So Benson had a hard time recruiting Christians for his prayer experiment, even though that was the intention, because a lot of churches said no. So he turned to something called silent unity, which is part of the New Thought movement in the US, and that's quite similar to New Age. So their view on prayer is your purpose in praying is to quicken into activity the creative processes that lie at the root of being and out of which the world takes shape, man. So you see, it's quite similar to New Age. And of course, it could be interesting to see how New Age practices impact health. But when you sort of bind that together with Christian prayer, who of course understand prayer differently, the results get a bit mixed. Dawkins also doesn't mention that there are more prayer studies with a similar methodology. I can't speak. A similar method, let's say, that Benson used. For example, in '88, a physician called Bird and his team did a similar experiment and actually found positive effects of prayer, and it was repeated in 1999 by a doctor called William Harris. Now, all this is quite interesting, but I wouldn't say that this prove or disprove prayer. I mean, somebody getting through an operation without much complications is, a reasonable thing to pray for, but I wouldn't call that a miracle. Because as I see it, miracles are supernatural phenomena, or, alternatively speaking, events not exclusively caused by natural processes. So if you imagine, for example, that a miraculous healing occurs, that a God intervenes into the universe and gives a blind person their sight back. Of course, that involves something natural, namely the body and the eyes of the blind person, but in order for us to say a miracle, that requires something supernatural going on. And with supernature, I simply mean things that are not nature, things that are above nature, so to speak. And of course, the question is, can you actually demonstrate that this happened? If science is only interested in nature, how could you possibly find scientifically anything supernatural? And I think that the key to that is identifying things that, at least as far as it comes to our current scientific knowledge, is inexplicable. So what I've been looking at in this book that I've written, called Dokumenterade Mirakler, only in Swedish at the moment, what I've been looking at, I call scientifically inexplicable cures after prayer, which takes a long time to say. So I shorten it into SICAP. So whenever I say SICAP, I talk about cures that occur after prayer that are scientifically inexplicable, according to whom, you may ask? Well, according to the physicians who have looked at the case. And all of the cases that I include in my book, several different physicians have looked at. And from these SICAP, I argue philosophically that it's reasonable to think that at least some of them are miracles. And from the existence of miracles, I think one can reasonably think that there is some kind of God. So I call this the three-step rocket of my book. From SICAP to miracles and to God. And since our time is limited, this lunch, I will focus on the first step. So I will demonstrate several cases of SICAP and then show you how I think that one can reasonably think that miracles exist based on them. And I'm also going to present to you the naturalist or atheist explanation to SICAP. So anyone with their pizza in hand interested in to hear some of these inexplicable cures? Yes. Good, very good, all right. So let's head to Africa together with Professor Candy Gunther Brown, who is at Indiana University. She went together with some physicians to Mozambique in 2009 because they've heard about this missionary organization called Iris Global, who go into the bush, the very remote areas of Mozambique, and they show a movie about Jesus, and for many villagers it's the first film they ever see. And after that they say, Jesus is alive, he heals people today, so let's pray for the blind and deaf in this village. And they've been doing that for several years and planted a lot of churches due to that. Now, Candy Gunther Brown was curious to see, are people actually healed from these visual and auditory impairments that they encounter? So she went there in 2009 together with his missionary organization and tested people who received prayer for healing before and after the actual prayer. And here are some results that were published in the journal, Southern Medical Journal, in 2010. Now, to the upper right, you see that that's a result of the auditory impairment. And the higher that these barns, no, they're not called barns, bars. Barn is something completely different. So the higher these bars are, the higher the auditory impairment is. So they could not hear as much if the bar is higher than compared to if it's lower. The black bar is left ear before prayer. The white bar is right ear before prayer. And these stripes ones are the results after prayer. Now keep in mind, this is a decibel scale, so it's logarithmic. So for example, 100 decibel is actually 100 times greater than 80. And so some of these changes are quite significant. As you can see, not all changes were very dramatic, and some didn't change at all. But in other cases, the cures were quite dramatic. And here you have the results when it comes to vision changes. So the black bar is the visually impairment before prayer, and the white bar is after prayer. And here as well, you can see quite dramatic changes. Sometimes nothing changed, right, or slightly. But in other cases, they were almost completely cured, in fact. Which, of course, is quite significant, because the only difference between these tests was just prayer. And many of these tests occurred just 10 or 15 minutes in between. Now, to be a little bit more concrete, Candy Gunther Brown goes into detail on some of these cases in our book, Testing Prayer, which was released in Harvard University Press. And she tells about, for example, Martine, who lives in a village called Nanumo. And it's not her picture here, but this is Heidi Baker, who was the leader and is still of this missionary organization and who prayed for Martine. So before prayer, Martine could not hear 100 decibel over the usual hearing level on either ear, and she could not read the top line at the visual board. So they used this commonly used board that you might encounter at the doctor. You know, instead of letters, They use symbols due to the illiteracy in Mozambique, but the principle is the same, and poor Martine could not read even the highest symbol. But after prayer, she could hear 40 decibel in the left ear, 30 in the right ear, and her sight improved to 20/80, which is significantly better. And Brown compares her results to what research has shown to be health benefits of things like the placebo effect and hypnosis and other kinds of alternatives, so to speak. And her results were quite dramatically different. So these are cures that we really haven't seen anywhere else. And her suggestion was quite modest. She didn't jump to any conclusion in the paper that God exists, but she simply recommended other physicians and medical scientists to look into this deeper, because something seems to going on when people receive prayer, which cannot be reduced to the placebo effect. Now, I've also looked at several cases here in Sweden. So, for example, I've talked to Maria, who also was auditory impaired. So from 2012, she realized that she could not hear as well. She had to go to the doctor, and even with help, she could not speak in the phone, and she had trouble following conversation with multiple people at the same time, and it just got worse. So her physician actually told her that they need to do surgery, and if they don't do that, she will become completely deaf. So in 2016, the situation was even worse, and they were planning this surgery. But then she went to an ordinary church service, and there were two missionaries there who had been in Ethiopia and then talked about stuff that they perceived that God was doing there, and they ended their speak by saying that we would like to pray for healing here as well. So Maria went forward, received prayer, and then she went back to her seat, and after that, the worship songs started, and she could hear them. And so she has explained quite beautifully, I think, in her book, Miraculous, about how she then enjoyed every sound. So as she went home, she could hear her footsteps. At night, she could not sleep because of a mosquito in the room and because of the leaves outside and her husband's snores, which was the most beautiful sound she had heard for many years. And her life was dramatically changed. When I interviewed her, I did so on the phone. And so it's very hard for me to imagine that she could not even use the phone before, but of course that's not only what she and her family can testify to, but also her doctor. So she went back to the hospital, and they did a recheck. And these are the audiograms from May of 2016, before this service, and then September. And again, it's a measure of decibels, so it's a logarithmic scale. And you can see that before this event, she could not hear more than 50 decibel above ordinary hearing levels, whereas in September, her hearing was basically completely restored when it comes to lower hertz. When it comes to these higher frequencies, she could not hear things like crickets, yeah. But her doctor wasn't very surprised of that, because this is what we typically find the hearing levels to be of women at her age. And so the doctor, according to Maria, said that I have no explanation for this. You can call it a miracle. And when I looked at the medical records, the doctors are quite surprised, and they have no natural explanation to this occurring, because as far as they could tell beforehand, her cells had actually died, but now they had reappeared by some mystical reason. I've also looked at some international cases. So I've been in contact with a guy called Ben, who was hit by a car when he was 7 years old. And this car hit his leg and actually destroyed 7 centimeters of the bone. And it was quite severe. They went to the hospital, and at first the doctors were curious whether they needed to amputate or not. But they put his leg in a cast and told him to be still. And a lot of people prayed for him. His mother even had some kind of visionary experience when she perceived to see God putting a new skeleton in his leg. And after a while, they went back to the hospital, and the doctor was very surprised. So these are the x-rays. This is after the accident, and here his leg is restored. And what was really confusing to the doctor was not only that there had been, bone that simply had been put together, but as far as he could see, the bone had not been there. So he had no explanation to this. Even to this day, he doesn't understand what had happened because he can't explain it scientifically. I've talked to a guy called Jens, who's a football player in Umeå. He's a captain of the Umeå FC. And he was tackled in 2013 in April, and thought it was a concussion, but it actually was brain damage. So he was treated at the University Hospital of Norrland at the Neuro Rehab by 5 specialists. And they told him that, we can't get you back to where you were, but we'll try to help you adapt to these new circumstances due to your brain damage. Now, it was quite severe, so he couldn't listen to music, he couldn't watch TV, he couldn't be in groups with other people, he couldn't eat at restaurants and so on, because all this basically made him feel like his head was about to explode, and so he needed to go away. And this went on for several months. After a while, he actually convinced his doctors to get back to the football field, not as a player, obviously, but as a trainer for another team in Umeå. And they agreed. So as he went to his first match in February 2014, when he had been sick for 10 months, then his friend Lydia texted him. And I've talked to both Jens and Lydia. Lydia was somehow convinced that Jens would get healed that day. And so the text that she formulated to him was, "Today is your day, get to church and you'll be healed," which is a nice text to get. Now, Jens replied by saying that, well, I'm going on this match and I can't join, but thank you for thinking of me. And she replied, well, it's not the church that heals, but God heals, so we'll pray for you anyways. And then about 3:30, when he was sitting next to the football field and he had sunglasses and the öronproppar, earplugs, thank you. Then, all of a sudden, all his symptoms disappeared. And he thought, wow, football is the shit, Because he thought that perhaps I've got this, kick of adrenaline due to me enjoying this football game. So he didn't make much of it, but he went home, went to sleep, and then he woke up early the next morning, which up to that point had not happened since the accident, because when he had been due to this kind of pressure, he needed to sleep for 15 hours or something like that. And then he started to suspect that maybe that prayer actually did a difference. So that day he was very active. He helped with his father's work. He played football. He played tennis. He ate at a restaurant with his girlfriend and all those kinds of stuff. And these symptoms have not come back since. And his doctors were quite surprised. So I've had the privilege of looking at Jens' journals as part of my work. And they were very confused. They could not understand why he had been cured in this way. And so they actually argued with him that he was not well because there was no way he could be well. But of course, he could work 100% again, he could play football. And so eventually they actually said that he was treated. And Lydia, Jens met a few days after this had happened. And she was very happy to see him again. He had not been in church a lot due to him not really tolerating groups of people. And he asked her, when did you pray for me last Sunday? And the answer was 3:30. So that was quite significant, I think, that she prayed the exact moment that he actually experienced this cure, and he is well to this day. I looked at a case from North Carolina, a girl called Joy, who had something called vertical heterophoria, double sight. So one eye pointed upwards, the other pointed downwards. And this also caused a lot of migraines because the brain need to sort of deal with these very different images. And she also couldn't really tolerate bright lights. It was quite painful for her. And on the service, church service, during the worship songs, she experienced that God wanted to heal her, went forward for prayer, and a friend prayed for her. And when she then opened her eyes, her friend was very surprised because the eyes had not this heterophoria anymore. And this can be a little bit tricky to see. The resolution isn't the best. But this is basically a medical record explaining her condition and why she needed special glasses and so on. Whereas this is later confirming that her vision is 20/20. And same thing here, the doctors didn't really have any medical explanation for this. They were very happy for her, but they could not explain it due to natural factors why she experienced it. I talked to a guy called Bengt who had pancreas cancer. His doctor told him that you won't survive to Christmas. You need to end your life, say farewell to everyone, and pack your stuff, do everything that you need to do, because you're not going to survive to the next year. But all of a sudden, he was cured, and in his records that I've looked at, they do talk about palliative care. They used treatment, expecting him not to survive this whole thing, just to relieve the pain and so on. And all of a sudden, the cancer was gone. And his doctor, called Johan Raud, had no natural explanation for this. He was very happy, very surprised, but he could not explain it due to our current understanding of how pancreas cancer works. And I've also written about a girl called Benedicta, who took a very high paracetamol overdose, 16 times the lethal injection one can do. Why did she do that? Well, she was 3 years old. She didn't know what she was doing. As you can see, she survived. And her doctor, Ronald Kleinman, was very surprised by this. Her family are Catholic, and so they prayed earnestly that she would be healed from this. And even though she was in a coma and the results from her liver tests show that the liver was severely damaged by this overdose, all of a sudden she woke up and new tests confirmed that there was nothing wrong with her liver. Kleinman even said it was as if she received a new liver somehow. And the Vatican was very interested in this. So he went on testifying in Rome about this. He said, "I'm not religious, but there's no other word I can use for this than a miracle." And I've also written about Sivet, who is a pastor who had severe breathing difficulties. He needed to put on a special gas mask at night. He needed to have this rollator, not rollerblades. This kind of support to just help him walk. He had trouble speaking in the phone. But he went to a prayer meeting in Övre Sopporo, and that's how you know that you're in the north of Sweden. So in Övre Sopporo, people prayed for him. He could all of a sudden breathe. And her doctor, Eva Norman at Norrlands Universitetssjukhus, had no explanation for this. She had previously said to him that there's nothing I can do for you. But after this happened, she wrote that he has prayed to God and received help from Jesus. So that's from his medical record. So SICAP is a thing. When I've been talking to Christer Sturmark, who was the previous chairman of the Humanist Society in Sweden and a well-known atheist, he agreed with me that an atheist cannot deny that SICAP exists. It's actually quite obvious that, yeah, there are cures that occur after prayer, and some of them don't have a scientific explanation. In fact, a 2004 survey that included over 1,000 American physicians showed that 55% of them had witnessed cures that they would describe as miraculous or scientifically inexplicable. And since there are 1 million physicians in the US, that's quite significant. So there is a lot of this. Now, I've encountered some people who argue that scientifically inexplicable cures aren't a thing. And some of those arguments are not very good, I think. So I'm going to briefly mention them, and then I'll move on to show why I think that we can go from SICAP to a miracle. Now, the first insufficient escape route is to say that it's placebo. And that's not really valid because placebo is a known effect, a very interesting one. It's basically the effect of believing that one is treated makes you feel better even though you aren't treated. But of course, placebo is a known effect that all physicians know about. And what we can observe scientifically is quite limited placebo. So it's limited to reducing pain, anxiety, and things like that, and for a while. And so that's not really something that's going to make a deaf person hearing or brain damage disappearing and so on. It's not magic. Would be cool if it was, but it's not. So the placebo effect that we know about can't really explain any of these cases, because if it could, the physicians wouldn't say that they're scientifically inexplicable. Now, some will say that it's spontaneous remission, and this to have some sort of more legitimacy than the placebo route, I think. Spontaneous remission is basically the body healing itself, and this term is used quite a lot in the literature regarding cancer, because sometimes we can see cancer disappearing and we know that it's not due to treatment, but still it disappeared. However, according to a quite large Cochrane study that looked at all the known cases of spontaneous remission during most of the 20th century, in 87% of cases, we have no idea what it is. And so in that sense, I think it's hard to offer spontaneous remission as an explanation for the inexplicable, because in most cases, we don't really know what spontaneous remission is. And so in that sense, it can just be used as another term for these inexplicable cures, whereas the explanation must be found some level deeper, I think. Another thing that some people have said is that the doctors have simply been wrong when they say that these types of cures don't have a scientific explanation. They might have been sloppy. They might have had the wrong diagnosis from the beginning and so on. And of course, doctors are humans. Humans make mistakes. But most mistakes that are being made are made due to rush and due to people looking over alternatives. Whether reaching the conclusion that there's no scientific explanation to this is a bit awkward and requires more research. All the cases that I've included in my book involve several different physicians. So I'm a bit skeptical to this reasoning. I think that, yeah, sure, it could be possible, but it's very unlikely that all these cases of SICAP is due to the doctors being wrong. And so far, nobody who has read the book, who is a physician, and several physicians have read it, have contacted me and saying this and this and this and this are natural explanation, you're simply wrong. So I think it's fairly safe to say that there are indeed cures that actually are scientifically inexplicable according to the science that we have today. And that leads me to the only really two possible explanations that I see for SICAP. And the one is miracles, here on the right, but the other is unknown natural phenomena. So for example, when I talked to Christer Sturmark, he argued that, yeah, SICAP is a thing, but they're not due to miracles, they're not due to a god, they are due to us not knowing yet what the natural explanation is, but there are natural explanations there. And that's, of course, not the same thing as saying the doctors are simply wrong, because how could they give an explanation that nobody knows about? So since it is possible that there are phenomena that we don't know about yet, then SICAP could be due to that. And I think that's a legitimate response to a single SICAP. Yeah, we could conceive that it's possible that we simply haven't discovered a natural or scientific explanation yet. However, my argument is that the most likely scenario that we find ourselves in is that when it comes to SICAP, they're splitted in between unknown natural phenomena and miracles. I think the most probable range is somewhere in between. So rather than saying that all SICAP are unknown natural phenomena or that all SICAP are miracles, I think the truth is somewhere here. And it doesn't really matter where it is, because except from all SICAP being unknown natural explanations, all this range means that miracles exist. And in the book, I dedicate 100 pages to this argument. And I'm now going to use 5 minutes to summarize it. So are you ready for some sonic speed? All right, the first reason I think this is that miracles aren't impossible. Now, some philosophers have argued that a miracle is really impossible. It's sort of a contradiction of terms. Voltaire is a famous one. In Sweden, we had Ingmar Hedenius, who in his book Tro and vetande, Faith and Knowledge, argued that miracles can't happen per definition. However, their arguments have not been proven very successful. So among philosophers today, hardly anyone chooses this route. A very influential atheist philosopher called J.L. Mackie even thinks that it's absurd to think that miracles are impossible, because it's very rare that even atheists say that the existence of a God is impossible. Even though they don't believe that there is a God, you can't really stretch it to it's logically impossible. And so due to that, Mackie says that, well, if it's possible that there is a God, then obviously it's possible that there are miracles. I would even go further than that and say that one can possibly conceive with more logical problems, at least with some traditional formulations of the concept of God, whereas miracles, I can't really find any logical way of putting forward that they would be impossible. Voltaire did it basically by his own pantheism. He believed that nature is God, and so he argued that if something happens that is above nature, it will be above God. But obviously, if you don't share his theological assumptions, if you're, for example, an atheist or a Christian, there's no reason to listen to that argument. So due to this, I think miracles has to be a possible option. Even the one that doesn't think that any SICAP is due to a miracle, I think can acknowledge that it's possible to conceive. It's a rational option for a person to have that miracles actually could be the explanation for at least some SICAP. So that's my first argument. And my second one is that naturalism obviously has a harder time in this discussion. As I mentioned, the naturalists, the one that argues that miracles don't exist, have to argue that all SICAP are due to unknown natural explanations, whereas the one who believes in miracles have a bit more comfier seat. So the one who believes in miracles can say that just some SICAP are due to miracle, or perhaps even just one, and that would still mean that miracles exist. Now, it's not impossible for naturalism to bear this burden, but it certainly makes it harder as a starting point for a naturalist, due to them having to explain every single SICAP, whereas the one that believes in miracles can be content with just some. The third reason is that unknown explanations are normally perceived as unlikely. So let me ask the student of Chalmers, why is it hot during the day? That's a tricky question, I know.
The sun is higher up in the sky, shining at a more direct angle.
That's a very interesting hypothesis. I don't agree. I don't think it's due to the sun. I think it's due to something else. But what that something else is, I can't say because I don't know what it is. I can't provide you with any arguments. I can't provide you with any evidence, because how could I? Nobody knows what it is. But that's definitely it. The sun being up, that's just a coincidence. So did I convince anyone? In Uppsala, everybody would be convinced. Well, as you can see, I'm trying to illustrate that, it's always theoretically possible, I think, to put forward perhaps something that happens is due to something that we don't know about yet. And of course, the classical examples that fellow atheists always give me is that, our ancestors here in Sweden, if you had Swedish ancestors, they believed that thunder was due to Thor, doing stuff. But now we know that, clearly I'm not a natural scientist or a historian. In any ways, they would describe thunder as the activity of Thor, and now we know that it has other, explanations behind it. So knowledge is developing, sure. But I think that normally we don't really seem to think that this unknown thing is really the most likely scenario. If something that was unknown becomes known and it better suits our explanation of reality, then obviously it's a valid option. But normally I think we're quite content, at least at parking our understanding of the world with the commonly known hypotheses and waiting with jumping to the unknown when it becomes known. And so that's why I think it's a bit weird to say that SICAP are definitely due to something that we don't know about and that nobody has found yet. While it's theoretically possible, I don't see how you could describe it as likely. The fourth reason is that SICAP are quite diverse. So in the book, I have cases of blindness, deafness, brain damage, as you've seen, cancer, allergy, even ALS, MS, and more diseases, sicknesses, and damages being cured in ways that the physicians can't explain. So there's a broad range. I think that if the only SICAP that we saw was, for example, visual impairment being cured, then a person like Christer Sturmark would have a better case saying that this is due to something that we haven't discovered yet, because it's so specific, and you would expect if there was a God to be, cures and healing having a broader range. But in fact, it seems to be quite a broad range already. And this, in turn, makes naturalism even less likely, I think, because when it comes to miracles, one can point to a single source, the miracle or the wonder-working spiritual being, whereas reasonably, if there are these unknown natural explanations, there have to be many. And for many of them to be undiscovered still is even less likely than if it was just one thing that we haven't really realized yet. And the fifth and final reason is that many SICAP are combined with spiritual experiences. And by that I mean things like, hearing a voice, seeing Jesus or some kind of spiritual being, experience an extreme coincidence like Jens being cured at the same moment that Lydia prayed for him on the very day that she believed that he would be healed. And normally, atheists and skeptics, they brush this away and say, well, that's just coincidence, that's just hallucinations when people think that they see Jesus and so on. And sure, that you could say that, but when it is combined with a cure that we actually know is scientifically inexplicable, naturalism gets stretched, I think, because then you have to argue for this natural explanation to both of these things that are seemingly combined, and that just puts another weight on naturalism in this debate. And so for all these reasons, I think it is actually unlikely that unknown natural phenomena explain all SICAP, which means automatically that miracles exist. Now again, even if you're not convinced by this, I hope that I have communicated how one reasonably can think, due to the existence of SICAP, that miracles exist. So religious people who believe in miracles aren't necessarily irrational in doing so, especially when they've looked at these cases. But it's a valid option to explain the world. And so that's what I've tried to communicate. Now, I'm very interested in hearing if there are any questions about this. And there seems to be. So please go ahead, sir.
I have knowledge of a few cases where people have received healing, what they perceive to be healing, and due to that they do a choice or something and they die because of it. Like recently I heard about a case where a guy stopped with his medication and then due to the impacts of that medication he died. That was after prayer.
Mm-hmm.
How do you stand on cases where people receive prayer but the outcome is the opposite?
Yeah, sure. Just to get you correctly, was the prayer concerning him to be healed? He thought he was healed and then he stopped his medication. Yeah, of course. And there have been quite severe mistakes, I think, in the past in Christian circles where you emphasize miracles and healing to demonize the medical community. And some have even argued that you shouldn't go back to your doctor, you shouldn't listen to their recommendations, and so on. And I think that's a severe mistake. Even when you go back to the roots, to the Bible, one of the Gospels about Jesus is written by a physician known as Luke. So physicians that use nature and natural processes and our medical knowledge in order to heal people originally have been seen as something obvious and something that Christians should welcome. So I think that the idea that healing will be in opposition to listen to your medical advice is quite dangerous. And so while I welcome that people pray for each other, and a lot of people do, it's quite natural when you know that somebody is sick that you pray for them, you should always listen to the doctors. And that's why the medical records has been sort of my authority in this research. Some people have contacted me and said, yeah, you have to look at my case. I was miraculously healed, but then it shows in the medical records that the physician is not convinced of that, and I have not included that in the book. So for me, it's really important to listen to what the medical staff says concerning this. Yeah? Oh, sorry, I was pointing up there. You can go next.
Do you believe that these examples of healing are exclusive to Christianity, or does the SICAP concern other religions as well?
Very good question. I don't think that they're exclusive to Christianity. There has been quite an interesting development when it comes to anthropological research, because anthropology, which I'm influenced by, apart from theology, I've studied peace and development studies. Anthropology is very influenced by post-colonial theory. And post-colonial theory emphasizes that in the past, a lot of science had been committed with a very Western bias. And when it comes to anthropologists, they go out to this heathen nation and look at this silly culture, and they write about them. And so they wanted to go away from that and be post-colonial in their thinking. And then they realized, well, then we can't assume that naturalism is true, because that's a Western idea. And so there have been quite an interesting development in several research papers and books from anthropologists looking at these cultures that are not Christian. They adhere to forms of animism and nature religions, and these anthropologists have recorded things that they are convinced are supernatural. In fact, some of these Western anthropologists have converted to become shamans and the like. And so I see no reason as a Christian to deny that there can be supernatural phenomena outside of Christianity, because even the New Testament assumes that. When Jesus encountered what he described as unclean spirit. Now, theologically, I don't think that that's due to God's activity, but I have no reason to deny or question that SICAP and even miracles can exist outside the bounds of Christianity. Now it's your turn.
My question is somewhat the same, but is it a reaction to prayer or such? I mean, is it a reaction, or would these miracles happen anyway? Or is it because of the prayer they're healed?
Yeah, that's a good question. In order to, sorry?
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, do these miracles happen due to prayer, or can one imagine miracles happen without any prayer involved? And I think that one needs to differentiate between how to think about miracles and the activity of God theologically when one is already convinced that these things exist. Because then what one could stipulate that, perhaps God sometimes intervenes even when people haven't asked about it. But I try to show to someone who is skeptical that it's reasonable to believe in these things. And then I need to focus on clear examples. So when it comes to the concept of miracle, I don't think that needs to be limited just to healings, just to cures. I think miracles can take a lot of different shapes and forms, but these cures are easily documented by the doctors. And I also have limited myself to look at when the connection to prayer is quite clear, because then it's very reasonable to expect if miracles would exist, they would look like SICAP. So if we say that we possibly live in a world where miracles can exist, where do those happen? Well, SICAP is a good place to look. So that's how I think. All right, here.
Yes, I have so many questions. I would like to sit down
Good.
for like 3 hours or so.
Let's do it.
I think one of the questions, you just said that in other cultures and in other religions where these kinds of unexplained healings occur, you don't think that God is immediately intervening. So I'm trying to understand why God is, as I see it, an excuse in specifically Christianity and specifically in prayer. As you acknowledge that these kinds of unexplained healings can happen, why is it a miracle? Why isn't it only something that we cannot explain yet? Why bring God into this?
Well, I've tried to argue why I think it's not very likely that all SICAP have natural phenomena. I'm not going so far as saying that all SICAP are definitely miracles. And when I've talked about miracles in this talk, I've talked about them in a religiously neutral sense. I've described them as supernatural phenomena. So you can do a SICAP research based on Hinduism, and I think that one can get to the same conclusion. So even though I use Christian example because I'm a Christian and those are easily accessible to me, I think that a Hindu or Muslim or someone else could use the same argument, and even as that I, as a Christian, could use these examples from other religions. The reason I don't think that it is God who do these kinds of supernatural things in shamanism is due to me being a Christian, and for several other reasons. I think that Christianity is true, and that would mean that these kind of spiritualist religions are due to still spiritual actors, but it's not divine actors. So that's really me looking at these cases from a Christian standpoint. So that's why. And I tried to sketch in the book how one could possibly, argue for Christianity specifically due to miracles, but that argumentation is a bit weaker, and I think needs support from other kinds of arguments. And so a popular argument for the truth of Christianity is to argue that the resurrection of Jesus is a historical event. And normally, that discussion is halted by the fact that when one discusses that with an atheist, the atheist would typically say, well, of course it can't be a resurrection because it's a miracle. Miracles don't happen. So I think that if my argumentation for the existence of miracles, which is in itself a religiously neutral argument, it just says that miracles exist, that can give additional to support to an argument that's very focused on the truth of Christianity, because if Jesus did rise from the dead, then Christianity has to be true in opposition to other religions. And so I think that God needs to be considerated when looking at these inexplicable cures after prayer, because, again, if it's just possible that there is a God, if it's possible that miracles exist, then they would appear as SICAP. As we go around in the world looking for miracles, SICAP is a good starting point because they look, I think, exactly like miracles if miracles exist. And so that's why I focus on them and argue that I think it's unlikely that they're all unknown natural processes. I think we have to move on, but if you have some time afterwards, I'd love to stay and talk a bit more.
Absolutely.
All right, let's see who we take next. Perhaps you.
To call anything scientific, you have to be able to do empirical tests on them, which by definition are recreatable. So are there any cases which, like these, have been recreated in a controlled environment, which you can look at every variable and say it's not this, or these two combined, and it's exclusively the prayer responsible for these miracles?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I acknowledge that I'm in a place where there are a lot of natural scientists and technicians and all that. Sorry, the question was, in order to say that something is scientific, it needs to be replicable. So are there examples of this being conducted in a controlled environment when one can exclude every other option than prayer being responsible for the cure? Now, my conviction is that we need to group science and philosophy together in this discussion, and that's essentially what I do. So the scientific part of what I've been doing is identifying what competent medical scientists today cannot explain by the natural science that we have. And so identifying the SICAP, I then argue philosophically. So really the meat of my argument is a philosophical argument. And of course, some people are skeptical to philosophy and think, why would we need that when we have science? And my response to that would be that science in itself rests on philosophical assumptions. Now, I would really like to see more experiments being done in this field, because there is a stigma to this. I mentioned Candy Gunther Brown's study that was published in a medical journal, and her book was published at Harvard. She has received a lot of criticism for doing the study. And even when similar prayer studies have been reviewed in Läkartidningen, the physician's magazine here in Sweden, there are medical researchers who say that, basically, thank God that we don't do it here. They don't want even the research to be done, and I think that's a mistake. And that's an area where Christer Sturmark and other atheists, Anna Bergström, who is the current chairman of the Humanist Association, they agree with me that we need more of these studies, and we would appreciate more of these studies, because knowledge in itself is not dangerous. So due to the stigma being quite severe, and there's a lot of reaction when one tries to do this, not as much has been done as I would have wished. But sure, I would love to see more control studies where one really tried to pinpoint the eventual effect of prayer. All right.
So I was wondering, so what's your
Mm-hmm.
But in a sample size with several billion people, should we surprise that there are outliers, especially since each individual person is a very complex system where it's very hard to actually trace any cause and effect with good accuracy?
Good question. I know that you and I have talked about this before. There's a video of YouTube where I and Simon talk more about this. I don't remember the title though.
Yeah, I don't remember, but Google Simon Liljestrand and Mikael Grenholm.
Yeah, exactly. I should put it on the website, dokumenteradmirakel.se. But yeah, it's a good question. I think that, one can reasonably expect anomalies when it comes to large populations. I would caution the naturalist because I think that naturalism has taken a few steps too far, too fast, right? So the naturalist basically argues that there are no supernatural phenomena and that we can be confident in that natural phenomena are the only ones that occur. And still, there are a lot of these question marks in a naturalist framework. So at least I don't think that one can really sit comfortable as a naturalist and just saying, well, there's a lot of clutter, there's a lot of things that we don't understand, but that's because we're so many people. I think that if naturalism were true and one was a confident naturalist, one would not want to see hardly any of these anomalies. So that's why I think this still is a challenge, and also due to the surrounding factors that I've talked about, when these inexplicable cures seem to be combined with these other experience that people perceive as supernatural or spiritual, then I think that it's a little bit too much of a stretch to just shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's a coincidence, and that's a hallucination, and that's something that is due to the body being complex. I think more works need to be done in actually trying to identify what this actually is due to. And of course, just letting the explanation of miracles into your worldview system is quite comfortable in that sense, because then you can explain that. Now, granted, that could open other questions as well. Obviously, does that mean that there is a God? In that case, which God, and so on. But I think the naturalist, I find it a bit too radical to just say that nature can explain everything, and then when you encounter all of these things that our natural science cannot explain, just saying that it's due to us being many. So that's my opinion on that. All right, there we go.
Thank you. So what would you claim that the relationship is between the effectiveness of prayer and the amount of people praying? For example, if we would have 1 billion Christians praying for somebody who, doesn't have an arm, will the arm grow out?
Sure. Let me look in my book. Oh boy. I can't find it in my book. Now, what I wanted to find was there was a guy called Galton. He was the cousin of Charles Darwin. And he argued that he can show that prayer does not work, because he asked his readers, who receive most prayers in the world? Well, the answer obviously is the royal family of the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom was an empire. And so in all Anglican churches across the world, every Sunday people prayed for the health of the royal family in England. And so Galton basically did an empirical study looking at the health and the life expectancy of people belonging to the royal family compared to the rest of Britain, and found that they were less healthier than the general population. And then he argued, well, this clearly shows that prayer doesn't work. I would say that it indicates, the effects of the royal diet and, assassinations and things like that. But obviously, there is a theological assumption that Galton makes. Basically, the more people that pray, the more effect the prayer has. And there are some theological problems to that. For example, that would mean that God really prioritizes the rich and powerful and famous, like the royal family. And so if one questions that theological assumption, I don't think that one should expect it to be this very linear relationship between the amounts of people praying and the effects themselves. In fact, the cases that I've collected, if one interprets them as miracles, or most of them as miracles, I think it gives support to the theological idea that's quite common today among Christian circles, that prayer can look very different, and that there's not just one single factor that affects a result of prayer happening, because they are quite diverse. And so I don't really see any reason to expect a very linear relationship between the amounts of people praying and the effect actually happening. Our time is running out, I'm afraid. It's 1 o'clock right now. If you have more questions and if you have more time, I'll be here for a couple of more hours at least, so you can catch me. And thank you very much.